Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And we're going to hear a little bit about that in the sermon. How many of you have had that neighbor? You know what I mean. The one who borrows your tools and never returns them. The neighbor that comes for a quick visit and way overstays their welcome. The neighbor who is picky about where you place your garbage can. The neighbor whose pet uses your yard instead of their own. The neighbor that plays loud music way into the night. The neighbor who complains when you play your loud music way into the night. The list could go on and on, couldn't it? The truth of the matter is that we are all different people with different ideas of what's right and what's wrong, and that can sometimes lead to some minor neighborhood differences, or it can also lead to some big differences. In fact, it can lead to some enmity. It is never a pleasant thing to be enemies with your neighbor, but it does happen. And sometimes it happens on a larger scale with our wider neighborhood. Differences in politics, in religious beliefs, racial, ethnic, and cultural differences, differences in gender identities. Our differences sometimes become so large that we might decide who our enemy is even before we've ever met them. This is not a new phenomenon. As far back as history, we see divisions. Cain and Abel, David and Goliath, Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, the Israelites and the Samaritans. That was a biggie that had been simmering for centuries. Those Samaritans. Imagine the hatred right now between Ukraine and Russia, the enmity between Muslims and Jews, enmity between races and genders, and you name it. Enmity, it seems, against anyone with any difference from our own. At the time that Jesus is telling this parable, there is enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans, in which both politics and religion are involved, a double whammy. So when the good and upright lawyer asks Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" in verse 29, it is downright shocking and even offensive that Jesus uses a Samaritan as the hero in the illustration or parable that follows. Let's hear that part of the passage now. Here it is in the Message translation. Looking for a loophole, he asked, "And just how would you define neighbor?" Jesus answered by telling a story. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw him, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." What do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? The one who treated him kindly, the religious scholar responded. Jesus said, "Go and do the same." That is a pretty blunt teaching of Jesus, one that is not always easy to take. We feel that we do a pretty good job of being good neighbors, but aren't we a good neighbor mostly when our neighbor is also good? What about when our neighbor is difficult or weird or different? What about when our neighbor is of a different religious or political background? Can we be a good neighbor then? What about when our neighbor is transgender or a same-sex couple? What about my tatted up and pierced neighbor? What about my poor neighbor, my differently abled neighbor, or my neighbor that I just don't like? And then, do we as Christians have a responsibility to make an effort to care for not just our next door neighbor, but our neighbors here in our community? What is the underlying benchmark that Jesus points to here? Compassion. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. And then the compassion turns into helpful, meaningful actions. Did you know that when we imitate the compassionate, merciful Samaritan, we are imitating the compassion of Christ himself? And not only that, Jesus tells us that when we do offer such help, that he receives it as though we are offering it directly to him. I would say that is pretty important. Now, friends, we can be perfectly merciful and compassionate. We cannot be perfectly merciful and compassionate at all times to all people. That is overwhelming and nearly impossible. But I do believe that every time we stop and take a very close look at our neighbor and allow ourselves to see beyond the surface, we become a little bit more like the Samaritan. When we widen our circle to include versus exclude, we welcome instead of avoid. Then we take a step in the right direction. We come just a little closer to following Jesus' instruction to go and do the same likewise. Now,